I hate sustainability as an objective.
Alex Evans is our guest today. Alex is the founder and executive director of Larger Us, a community of change makers seeking to bridge divides and bring people together.
I was really doom scrolling. I just couldn't sort of stop.
We're letting the algorithm tell us who we are.
If you take doom and gloom messages about climate, those are the most effective if what you want is virality. But if what you want to do is inspire people to take action, they're the absolute worst. We're not going to get back to a situation where everybody in any given society believes one religion and that is the source of that society's shared values. But at the same time, we can't have a situation where we have no shared values.
Are you saying that Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion aren't necessarily doing their campaigning in a helpful way?
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Re-Enchanting podcast. I am Belle Tyndall.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we are the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. And we are so excited to once again be pondering this theme of re-enchantment. Are we craving it? Are we lacking it? Is the Christian story a place where we can find it?
Alex Evans is our guest today. Alex is the founder and executive director of Larger Us, a community of change makers seeking to bridge divides and bring people together. Well, Alex has actually previously worked as a think tank researcher, as a special advisor to 2 cabinet ministers in the UN Secretary General's office, and as a consultant for organizations from Oxfam to the US National Intelligence Council. Don't know if you're doing any work for them at the moment, Alex, but it's given, though, Alex, a perspective on just how bad things can be in the world. Indeed, many have described our era as a polycrisis or permacrisis, place of climate change, war, technology, immigration, the rise of extremism, all threatening to destabilise society. So how do we deal with this 24-hour doom scrolling that we're all become accustomed to? And how can Christian faith speak to a world where everything often seems to be falling apart? I really started engaging with your work when you started your Substack last year, Alex, The Good Apocalypse Guide, which I just think is a brilliant title for a Substack. And that's really about, I think, how we can survive and thrive during the sort of times we're living in. So we're going to try and re-enchant the end of the world today.
No, there's no mean feat.
But we always begin with our first question.
Oh, before we ask you to re-enchant the end of the world for us, Alex, we'll start small. What are you reading is always our first question.
Yeah, well, I'm rereading Ben Judah's amazing book, This is London. If you haven't come across it, it's been out for quite a few years now. And it's a set of stories of people who live in London, but it's the sides of London that we often don't see. And I'm probably 6 or 7 chapters in, and already we've met a burglar, we've met a police officer, we've stayed with people in a kind of doss house in Barking where it's 2 people kind of rotating in and out of a bunk. All these sides of London that are not that visible, but just the stories are gripping.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I mean, do you tend to be a voracious reader? Have you got a lot of books on the go?
I always have a lot of books on the guilt pile on my bedside table. I'm a much faster acquirer of books than I'm a reader of them. And I'm terrible at finishing them, which I gather is not atypical. Okay. The stats on how many people finish books are not great. Yeah. And I'm definitely one of the guilty parties there, but I do definitely love acquiring books.
You need a one in, one out policy, I think.
I wish I had that kind of discipline.
Yeah, I think that's what Nick Spencer, we had him in a previous series, and I think his wife insisted that he adopt a one in, one out rule.
Yes.
But you're not quite there yet.
I think I need to ask my wife to hold me to account in that way. It would be good for me.
I'm sure I've seen a meme going around that's based on Jesus and the woman at the well, which is you have one book and you also have 6 more sitting on your But anyway, speaking of books, I read on your Substack that the mentions of apocalypses in books are 6 times higher now than they were in 1960, the highest they've been for almost 200 years, in fact. So why are people talking about the apocalypse so much?
It's such an interesting one. I came across that factoid through Elizabeth Oldfield, and I had the same question, like, what is it that's driving this since the 60s? And I don't think we've got hard data on it. But obviously there were a couple of things that happened in the 60s that might have induced us to think about this. One is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think really landed for the public at large the existential threat that's there with nuclear weapons and how close we came to conflict. I remember my late grandfather was the press attaché at the time in the British Embassy in Washington, and talked about how for 6 successive nights he and my grandmother went to bed really not knowing whether they were going to wake up. And that is a deep experience that clearly left a very profound impression on him. The other thing in the 60s, I think, is that famous first photograph of Earth from space. First, the kind of Earthrise photo, and then a couple of years later, the blue marble photo. And I think those really brought home for people just the kind of fragility of this tiny little island of life in all that space. And I think it's no coincidence that the modern environmental movement got going more or less immediately after those photos. So I think a lot of it is rooted in that. And then obviously since then, we've had this very rich genre of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction, whether in books or now in movies. And that shows how much of an appetite there is.
The second season of The Last of Us has just come out, which is a sort of post-apocalyptic zombie kind of thing based on a video game originally. But it does feel like we've had just so many movies or TV series that basically are these rather kind of scary visions of what the future will be.
Right. And I think the fact that there are so many shows the voracious appetite that we have for it. And I think what that speaks of is how at some kind of unconscious level, or in our kind of dreams, or maybe nightmares is a better word, this is something that's really on our minds. And so when that surfaces this much in fiction, I think that's partly a reflection of what's already happening inside our heads.
I suppose that's a really interesting question, because was there a point where people were doing sci-fi that was more hopeful? I mean, I suppose you could look back, for instance, at Star Trek in the 60s. And that was, in a sense, a kind of quite positive vision of the future.
Yeah.
You know, people coming together to explore space together and kind of extend some sort of version of democracy, you know, across the whole galaxy. And then it kind of got replaced by, oh no, that's definitely not going to happen. It's going to be.
I think you're so right. And we really need those more hopeful stories of apocalypse, because a few years back, I wrote a book called The Myth Gap, which was all about collective stories and the way we use them to make sense of the world and where we're trying to get to and who we are. And one of the ideas in that is that stories can become self-fulfilling prophecies. They kind of create our realities as much as they describe them. My favorite example is what happens when you have a run on a bank. It starts as a story that circulates that there isn't enough money for everyone's deposits. And then when people start to act on the basis of that story and form a queue outside the bank, it becomes reality. And so the stories we reach for in really turbulent moments really matter, because they can kind of determine where we head. And if they're very gloom and doom stories, that's bad news. So I think it's a problem that so many apocalypse stories in Hollywood and in fiction, it's all about mass looting and martial law and everyone for themselves. These are not stories that talk about how we rise together to these moments.
You almost wonder whether, when we had a sort of apocalyptic moment during COVID and there was a run on the toilet paper and the flour, and it was like, okay, now we're kind of doing the self-fulfilling prophecy that this is what people do when these times hit, wasn't it?
And I remember those kind of heartbreaking tweets from kind of key workers like NHS workers at the time who were, you know, finishing these, you know, absolutely exhausting 18-hour shifts, and then going to the supermarkets and just seeing bare shelves because everyone else had been panic buying in the meantime.
It is weird, though. It does make me wonder about our psychology, that if we have these deep-rooted anxieties, and they're not unfounded, you know, about all of these crises, these permacrises, why on earth do we think, right, let's imagine the worst, how this could be at its most destructive. Let's just really dwell there.
And we created for entertainment.
And then let's spend 8 hours watching it. It makes me worry about us a little bit. So that's so helpful, the way you pulled out some of those things that were happening in the 60s that made, you know, this idea of an apocalypse. And we'll break open what that word means, I think, and what you mean by it as we go. But You've said that the truth is things are getting better and they're getting worse faster and faster. And so sort of the wonderful bird's eye diagnosis that you gave of the 60s, could you give us one of our present moment and maybe break open what you mean by things are better and they're worse?
Of course. I mean, it's so interesting that in a lot of ways, we've never had it so good, right? I mean, if you look at life expectancy, that's better than it's ever been in terms of global averages, in terms of certainly, you know, people here in the UK. If you look at, I don't know, things like how each of us now has a little computer in our pocket that gives us instant access to all of the world's knowledge. I mean, just absolutely, it's like your Star Trek example, Justin. I mean, it's kind of, you know, the hopeful side of sci-fi almost. If you look at the number of deaths in violent conflict, the evidence are that it's, you know, at a massive historic low at this point in history. And so, you know, in lots of ways, things, you know, why are we so anxious? Things are going really well. We live lives that are, you know, historically, by historic standards, very safe, very prosperous, very connected, and so on.
I remember Steven Pinker wrote a whole book, didn't he, on this, basically saying, hey guys, cheer up. It's actually much better than we're led to believe by the headlines in the news.
And I think that's one of the things that, you know, gives all of us day to day this sense of cognitive dissonance that you can be kind of thinking about your everyday stuff. You know, you've got to do the school run. You want to try and get to the gym. There's a few tasks you've got to take care of. And then suddenly you look up and it's like, oh my goodness, the wildfires. And the way that, you know, our information ecosystems and what we see on our phones is constantly batting us back and forth between these big, scary global trends and then how, you know, they're not always necessarily kind of, you know, part of our everyday realities yet, at least here, you know, in the UK. It does give us that sense of dissonance. And one of the things that I think is fascinating is this observation made by Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's this very interesting kind of writer and systems theorist, that when you have situations where things are getting worse and getting better at the same time, so you have, you know, increasing prosperity and you have climate change accelerating, it's an indicator of system instability, of how, you know, the current system, the current setup is unsustainable in the literal sense, like it's not going to be sustained indefinitely.
Yeah, we joked just before coming, just before we started recording about Paul Kingsnorth is the answer to so many questions. But that reminds me of something that he says. He said it on this podcast. He says it quite frequently as we talk about sustainability as if A, that's possible and B, that's the only goal. But he's like, but what are we sustaining?
Such a good question.
Like, do we want to sustain a permacrisis? Do we want to sustain this dissonance that we feel? Is that actually worth just keeping at all costs? I
mean, I've kicked around in environmental issues for 2, coming up for 3 decades.
Yeah,
I must admit, I hate sustainability as an objective. It sort of sounds like treading water. Like, let's prevent things from getting any worse.
It does.
Whereas the idea of restoration, let's mend the damage that we've done, not just to kind of ecosystems, but to our relationships with each other. I find that a much more kind of energizing frame. And the idea of kind of restoring relationships ultimately with ourselves, with each other, with creation and with God, I think is sort of central to all of this.
Do you think the fact that sustainability is the goal and even, you know, the language that we use around things says so much about us? I'm wondering whether it's one of two things. It sort of, it gives away our lack of hope, as in to restore anything feels too hopeful. Let's just sustain the brokenness.
Yeah.
Or does it reveal that actually we think we're nailing it, and if we can just keep ourselves on this, you know, we'll be fine because we're just getting better and better and better. Let's just sustain the progress. Do you think it's a bit of both, or one or the other? Or
I do think it's a bit of both, but I think you're onto something really interesting in the second one there, that I think exactly as you say, it does surface some quite linear assumptions. And I used to see it when I worked at DFID, the old Department for International Development, which sadly no longer exists. That whole idea of development, of that you had developing countries and developed countries, had this very linear assumption baked into it. Like, you know, we developed countries have arrived. We've finished the process. These other countries are on the way and they will end up where we are. And of course, you know, that reached its apotheosis with the whole idea of the end of history, which has been, you know, mocked forever since then. But I think one of the things that's so unsettling to people about this moment, when you see, for example, the sheer turbulence in the United States at the moment is, hang on, wasn't this supposed to be a country that had finished the process
This is one
and
of those
reached kind of perennial
we've arrived
stability,
countries.
and all you had to do now was sustain?
Wow.
Yeah, of course.
It is super interesting. And I mean, that's why I think your Substack is kind of just perfectly timed for the moment we're living through, when everything is suddenly up in the air again. And this, end of history idea that was surfaced in the 90s or whatever. Now everyone's like, okay, turns out history's got a bit longer to run. There's going to be some interesting episodes, certainly within our lifetime, it looks like. I mean, apocalypse, the word that you've used, and the good apocalypse for your Substack. I mean, obviously that's almost entirely associated with these negative, post-apocalyptic scenarios. But what does the word actually mean? And what do you mean by a good apocalypse?
Right. Well, I mean, in colloquial terms, of course, we understand apocalypse to mean the end of the world. And when we look at apocalyptic fiction, again, that's what it depicts. But of course, what it literally means in the original Greek is an unveiling or a revelation, a disclosure of what actually is the case. That sweeps
the
aside
name
illusions.
of the last book of the Bible, Revelation.
Exactly so. Yeah. And I think that's a really rich, creative way of thinking about it. And I think in that sense, COVID was, as you said earlier, a really interesting apocalypse. So it revealed, for example, who the real key workers are in the economy. It revealed all sorts of structural inequalities that we hadn't really noticed before. It also revealed how actually the thing that makes life worth living is our connection to each other, and how when we're deprived of that, we all just kind of wilt inside. And so it was this kind of, massive disclosure moment. A whole lot of things were made apparent that perhaps hadn't been noticed as much before.
I find it so interesting the way we use the word apocalypse, because I actually think it's way more comfortable to look ahead and say this is what might happen than it is to use it in its proper way, which is to look at our present and what we are doing. Like, that is interesting. This is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable to do. And then what's also really interesting about a lot of the apocalyptic literature and movies and all these kind of things is that quite a few of them, the human race is just sustaining. Let's use that. We're just going along. And then something like a comet or a disease or zombies, like something interrupts us. And then that causes disaster, dystopia, utopia, whatever. Again, that's us really shirking responsibility. That's us really making a disastrous future something that isn't our fault. So again, that's also us being like, we're not going to look at what we're doing now. We're not going to engage in apocalypse as it was originally, understood. So I find all of that quite interesting as well.
Yes, that's really true. And I think another thing that those stories get wrong is how we behave in response to an apocalypse. Because I think, when you look at films like, I don't know, I Am Legend, or, there's such a long list of them. What you tend to see is like things fall apart. As I mentioned before, it's everyone for themselves. The looting is always a kind of motif of these movies. And it's very much the opposite of what really happens in the wake of a big disaster. There is this whole fascinating field called disaster sociology, which is the study of how people behave in the aftermath of things like kind of earthquakes or hurricanes. And it's not mass looting. It's not everyone for themselves. What actually happens in the aftermath of these massive shocks is people really show up for each other. You see enormous outpourings of solidarity and even of heroism. It's very much what psychologists call the tend and befriend response. That's whereby you're kind of tending to yourself and your immediate family group, but also befriending others to kind of create social networks to help you do the tending.
It's the sort of what was often described in the 40s as the Blitz spirit, wasn't it? They were living through a sort of apocalypse of sorts, and yet many people would say this was the making of us, and the way we pulled together and stood against that. There's obviously, in that sense, an apocalypse can be a catalyst. And I think you make this distinction between a sort of a breakdown and a breakthrough. And what you're trying to do, I think, with your writing is to say, look, how do we accept the big challenges that are ours in our generation, but how do we kind of, rather than being catastrophic about it, how do we actually say, no, this is an opportunity to actually do that gathering together and responding together? Right.
And I think that when moments of crisis come along, they can be the kind of the push into a breakdown, as you say. If you wanted to talk about it in systems theory terms, you might say kind of reduced complexity versus a breakthrough where we kind of rise and get increased complexity. Thinking about kind of ecosystems, you can kind of draw that parallel to how ecosystems respond to a shock. But I think, bringing that down to earth a bit, in our own lives, we all experience moments of crisis. And those can absolutely knock us for six and leave us kind of reeling and on the ropes. But sometimes crisis can be something that's, difficult and challenging at the time, but we come through the other side of it, and it sort of provides the impetus for growth or coming back stronger or discovering new capacities in ourselves. And that's some of what I mean by the idea of a good apocalypse, that there is a scenario here where we come together like never before at all different levels. I mean, at community level, national level, global level. And it's, whatever happens, I think, going to be a choppy, bumpy period, but that we come through the other side, not just having sustained, but having kind of broken through to something, much richer, more connected, more purposeful, because I think we can all see the shortcomings of modern life. And I think we can be more than this.
This leads us perfectly to Larger Us, of which, as Justin said right at the top, you're the founder and executive director. Firstly, can you break open a little bit of what Larger Us does? And in particular, you're a very solutions-based organisation, community. And I'm just wondering about some of the, we've painted somewhat of a bleak picture of what's going on. So right in the heart of that, can you tell us about some of the solutions that Larger Us are exploring?
Sure. So Larger Us has been running for 7 years. And what it grew out of was that I was running a national campaign against Brexit. This was back in kind of 2017. So after the first referendum, and this campaign, which obviously didn't work, was trying to secure a second referendum. And
there's still hope. One day.
Well, I was a bit horrified during, like I think everybody was in Britain, by the utter toxicity of the polarization that Brexit revealed, not just in national politics, but, within families and among friends and within communities. It was less like a normal disagreement and more like a kind of septic wound that had opened up. And I was just uncomfortably aware that, I don't think the campaign that I was doing was particularly divisive, but some of the organizations we were working in coalition with certainly were, really showing contempt towards leavers.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you mid-flow, but why? Because if you think, and I've listened to a recent episode of The Sacred with Elizabeth Oldfield where she really touches upon this with one of her guests, and she sort of makes the point that if you look at what it is, it's quite dry. A referendum to leave the European Union, it's actually quite a dry topic, what was it about it that made it so emotive, so charged, so energized, and sort of we all had quite visceral reactions to it, to something that is just quite sort of nitty-gritty policy in so many ways?
Yeah, it's such an interesting one, isn't it? I think there's this big sociological trend these days called the big sort. And this is this trend whereby we're more likely than ever before to live next door to, study with, befriend, work with, even marry people with similar backgrounds and outlooks to our own. And what had never happened, I think, certainly not to anything like this extent, but before Brexit, was those kind of identities hadn't showed up in politics. We didn't feel a deep sense of identification for the political parties we voted for. But then when Brexit came along, suddenly it did align with those identities, and the country assembled itself into these two kind of warring camps. And it came to feel not like just a political issue, but a fight over our way of life between an us and a them. And the them was seen as threatening to our very way of life. And that was true whether you were a Remainer or a Leaver.
And what became apparent was that it turned out a lot of people who were Remainers thought, well, of course we're going to remain because I don't know anyone who's a Leaver.
Exactly.
And all the ones who were Leavers thought, of course we're going to leave because I don't know any Remainers.
Spot on. And that's the big sort right there. Exactly. Most Remainers didn't know Leavers and vice versa.
So coming back to what you were saying, though, you were sort of campaigning for another referendum.
Right.
And what did you learn in the process?
Well, I mean, I think what I became fascinated by, well, one thing was this sense of discomfort with what conventional wisdom thinks is good campaigning. It's often thought in the campaigns world, which is where I've been kind of kicking around for years, that a good campaign is one with a really clear villain. You always want to have a resonant baddie as the heart of your campaign. And with Brexit, with that extent of division, I sort of started to think, hang on, there are risks here where if we're entrenching this kind of division, it actually makes it harder to achieve real breakthroughs on massive issues like climate change, for example, because these are kind of so-called wicked issues, and you need a consensus on them across society. And if only kind of one lot of people is in favor and one lot is passionately against, that makes that impossible. And of course, the US is the big cautionary tale here, where so many issues have become ultra polarized and nothing can get done. There's no kind of lasting settlement on anything. There's just this pendulum swing. So that was one thing that set me thinking about the risks of division like this. And then the other one was doing a lot of work around the same time on, do you remember Cambridge Analytica?
Yes.
And how they kind of purported to be able to mash up social media targeting and psychological profiling to kind of weaponize our own anxieties against us and use that to influence an election. So again, it was how political issues play out psychologically. And I remember looking at that and thinking, if any of what they say is true, then how on earth would you inoculate communities or societies against this kind of deliberate division? So all of that left me with these big questions about, must it be the case that campaigning has to be divisive? Aren't there ways of doing it that bring people together instead of dividing them? And also, in these very polarized times, how do we get past that as a society? How do we bring ourselves back together and start to reconstruct a shared vision of who we are and where we're trying to get to?
But you've set yourself what seems on the face of it possibly an impossible task, because as far as I understand it psychologically, it's much easier to create a fear reaction in someone than a positive empathy sort of reaction. And that's why politicians and everyone else, they always go for the fear, because you get results immediately, don't you? So
you're right.
How do you even begin to counter
But I
that?
think the thing is that, as we've already touched on, there's different ways that we can respond to things that we perceive as threatening. Now, one which you've just kind of touched on there, Justin, is the fight, flight, freeze reaction. So when we think something's threatening, and our amygdala, this little almond-shaped gland at the base of our brains, takes us immediately and automatically into fight, flight, freeze mode. And we all know how that feels. Your heart starts racing. There's adrenaline and cortisol flooding through your system. You're getting ready literally to fight or flee for your life. And if you are faced with physical danger, it's very good at keeping you alive. But for a political threat or a thing that you perceive as threatening or something you just looked at on your phone, this is not a helpful way to react at all. Because when we're in that state, we get less empathetic, more aggressive. We lock into our in-groups. We're scanning for threats. This is not a way we want to show up as citizens. But it is what we keep seeing in our politics.
Social media right now. That's
totally.
That's
and the
exactly
algorithms optimize for this because it's a good way of monetizing our attention. But there is an alternative way to respond to something you perceive as threatening. And it's that tend and befriend response that we touched on before. And one of my favorite quotes is, the great Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he, who'd lived through appalling experiences in the concentration camps in World War II, observed that, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically, when we perceive something as threatening, there is a moment where we can choose how to respond rather than go into an automatic response. And in that moment of choice lies our freedom. And I think that question, this is why I think politics increasingly these days is about what's happening in our heads. That if we're all allowing ourselves to be swept along by social media, by what we see on the news, into a fight, flight, freeze response, you end up with politics like it looks like in the US.
You make it reality. You make the narrative then drives.
So actually it turns out that it really matters whether we have the kind of the habits of mind, really, to be able to make that conscious choice about how to respond to something we perceive as threatening rather than getting swept along by our amygdala.
Do you think there's anything... do you think where we find ourselves in our historical context has anything to do with this as well? Because are we at a point where actually it's quite glamorous, and it's quite exciting and it spices things up to just go with our fear and go big and vote in the populist guy and do all of this? Are we too far removed from the last time where that really damaged us, basically? Are we just in this unfortunate part of history where we've got, our memory has become a bit short term and we've forgotten actually where this can take us?
I think there's certainly some of that. I think there's also just the kind of sense of desperation and disgust that a lot of people feel with politics, some of which is justified and some of which is not. I mean, the media do relentlessly feed us the worst side of politics. So we don't always see the kind of, when you have MPs who really believe in stuff and they fight for something worth fighting for, we don't hear about that so much. So our information ecosystem that we inhabit is part of this too. But no, I think you're quite right that there's a deep risk in forgetting the kind of historical risks.
And it feels like the internet revolution, social media is to some extent, as we said earlier, driving this. So, I mean, just to take a very practical example, what would you, as the head of Larger Us, say to the person who just can't seem to stop doom scrolling, who's just there on their phone and they just get depressed every time, but somehow they get drawn into this constant negative spiral of 24-hour news, everything's going wrong? I mean, is that an accurate reflection of what's actually happening in the world? And if it's not, how do we sort of live into it differently if we're so wedded, in a sense, so controlled by those narratives that now ping at us all the time?
You're right that the doom scrolling is real and it can become very compulsive. I remember how, I think it was 2021? We got through the pandemic and a lot of people really suffered with mental health during the pandemic. And I managed okay during the pandemic, but then there was that moment when all the American and European forces suddenly withdrew from Afghanistan. Do you remember that moment? There were those awful pictures of people kind of flooding onto the kind of tarmac at Kabul airport. And I remember, that was the moment where I was really doom scrolling. I just couldn't sort of stop. The tragedy of that moment, the sheer pain of, how many lives have been lost over 2 decades in that kind of long-standing conflicts in Afghanistan. And then, nothing, it was all just dismantled overnight. No lasting progress had been achieved. And it just sort of really hit home in a way that I didn't see coming. And for days afterwards, I was just constantly refreshing my phone and looking and just thinking, it's all so awful. And it did become kind of compulsive. And it's very easy to do because as you've already touched on, the thing about these social media platforms is they are designed to be addictive and feed the dopamine loops and keep monetizing our attention. And eventually I managed to kind of tear myself off my phone and realized I had to curate my information ecosystem a bit more. And so nowadays I try and read slower news and also make sure I get a fix of good news often because there is a lot of it about. I mean, just this morning I saw a story which isn't one I've encountered before in the media, that global rates of cancer are falling really impressively. Like they've gone down about 30% over the last 20, 30 years. Who's heard that story before? And I think just seeking out those sorts of things so that you have more of a balanced news diet is good for us, but also good for politics.
I don't think we were created, in a sense, to have this level of input or awareness almost of all the terrible things that... Because in a sense, arguably, there's always been bad things going on in the world. Now, it may feel like things are accelerating in our day, but the difference between us and our ancestors, I suppose, is they weren't confronted with it 24/7 through little screens. They only heard about that terrible earthquake maybe months later, from someone who traveled from that country.
Yes.
And it was like, but now we're sort of, like you say, it's our, what's it called again? The amygdala is constantly being sort of poked and prodded. And I can imagine that just ends up. I would imagine that's a lot to do with why people feel so generally tired out, burned out, depressed, anxious, is because we're kind of feeding ourselves that
and there was this fascinating piece of research that came out within the last year, and it was some researchers looked at, I think it was about 160 different sets of messages about climate change. and they tested them in a huge randomized control trial. And what they found, fascinatingly, was that if you take doom and gloom messages about climate, those are the most effective if what you want is virality on social media. But if what you want to do is inspire people to take action, they're the absolute worst out of the entire set. And so they found that the kinds of messages that are most effective at inspiring us to take action are positive, hopeful, yet urgent. Now, the urgent bit's important. We don't want to shy away from things are serious and we need to get a move on.
Yeah.
But you have to have the positive and hopeful framing, because if it's just doom and gloom, we end up in that kind of defensive crouch, just compulsively doom scrolling and in a place of deep overwhelm.
Yeah. I also wonder as well, thinking about the algorithm, I was chatting to someone who specifically works with algorithms just a few weeks ago. And he was saying that the problem is that we are fooled into thinking the algorithm knows us, when in fact we're letting the algorithm tell us who we are. It doesn't actually know us. So it's also as well, you know, when you get into this doom scrolling and the algorithm's kind of working you out a little bit, or so we think, but it's not, it's actually happening the other way around. It's not working us out. It's telling us who we are,
right?
If you know what I mean. And it really hollows us out.
Yes.
And I think something that I'm seeing, something that I experience, if I'm really honest, is I get packaged. So you're given this package and you're like, well, if you think this, you must also agree with these 4 policies and be against these 6 types of people.
Yes.
Or if you're of this religion, or if you're, you know, then I'm going to give you your wholesale views on all things. And I'm going to give you your enemies. I'm going to give you your allies. Just subscribe to it. And then I can keep feeding you proof that this is the right thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a bit of that.
And you see that even in innocuous places, like when iTunes is offering me new music. It's it is music that I like, but it's all very samey. It's decided, okay, Alex likes progressive house music and trance music, so we're just going to only feed him a solid diet of that. And what you don't get is the outliers, or sort of like, here's a really interesting new artist or label I've discovered. It's just more and more of the same.
Yeah.
Coming to what we haven't mentioned yet, really, is that you are a Christian, Alex. It's been interesting to hear a bit about your journey on that front. But again, lots of people have kind of assumed, well, that's part of the problem. They might especially look at some of the politicization in the US when it comes to religion and so on, and say, well, that's certainly not part of the solution. But your conviction is that actually religion and Christianity per se can be actually part of what helps us to get this breakthrough rather than breakdown version of the apocalypse. So do you want to speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can go either way. I think religion generally, and Christianity and any other religion we choose to mention, can take us to the kind of most beautiful places that humanity is able to go, but also some of the worst places. I mean, you know, we don't have to look far through the last 1,000 years to find many examples of Christianity at its worst, really bringing out kind of othering and hate and violence and so on. But it can do the opposite. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot for the last year or two is how I think of it as the religion-shaped hole in modern society, that actually, and it's something I started to get into with that book called The Myth Gap, which I wrote in 2017, which was all about how shared stories are really important to us as humans. They help us give us a sense of what's important, of like magnetic north, if you like. And nowadays, we don't really have that same set of deep shared stories that once we did. Myths have fared badly in modern times. I mean, it's I always like the idea that, well, it's not an idea, it's a fact. If you look up myth in the thesaurus, it's in the same entry as words like bunk and fabrication. Right. So we've decided in our modern scientific rational way that things are literally scientifically true, or they're not true at all. Yeah. So it's facts or nothing. And the kind of deeper poetic truths that religions offer us have not fared that well against this new kind of modern rational standard. And the problem is that nature abhors a vacuum, and without those deep shared stories, other kinds of stories start to come in and fill the gap. And I think many of those are these kind of stories like, you know, them and us. You are threatened by the other. Those sorts of stories that populists offer us. Or another set of examples is, you know, you are what you buy. That story that the marketing industry offers us. So I think that, and when I wrote The Myth Gap, I was really just thinking about stories. And I think I've realized since running Larger Us, like it's way bigger than just the stories. It's also about institutions and places where we gather, and we need the things that religions give us at their best, because historically religions are the institutions that have been in charge of the cusp of inner life and outer life in human existence. And now that we're less and less religious, we're not sure whose job this is. And as we've been touching on, that cusp of inner and outer, or psychological and political, however you want to talk about it, that's really live at the moment. You see it in the culture wars, you see it in climate breakdown on all different fronts. And we're just not sure where to take these very, very deep collective psychological ideas. And I think I have personally found Christianity incredibly helpful as a way of kind of making sense of some of this.
Because even the word religion, I understand religio means sort of holding together, if you like.
Right.
And there's a sense in which I completely agree with you. I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. I say something very similar in my own book, that we're living in this meaning crisis where we don't have a story, a communal story that makes sense to us. So we're all reaching for all these separate stories, but that creates these culture wars because none of them agree with each other. And,
exactly.
And we're all trying to put something in the God-shaped hole that is not meant to be there, whether it be arguably even, political activism on the progressive left, or, the stuff on the right, about savior figures in America. It's all sort of it's all very religious, ironically. It's just we've kind of channeled that religious impulse into all the wrong places.
Yes.
So I suppose, what is it kind of too late to put the genie back in the bottle, though? Because it feels like, as we often say on the show, we live in a very post-Christian world now and so on. Have we lost that story? Can we recapture that story? Can that story once again give a more communal sense of what the world is and how we could actually move towards redemption and transformation of the world, rather than just sort of all having our own separate stories that all end up bashing up against each other?
Big question. I mean, one of the ways I make sense of culture wars, I think, when you look at any culture war fissure on any particular issue, you often find that it's a unity versus diversity culture war, that there's one lot of people who are really into unity and insist we've got to all have shared values and they've got to be these values. And then you have another lot of people who go, no, I don't like the idea of shared values. We all want to be kind of diverse and different and free to choose who we want to be. And when those two very different worldviews come up against each other, you get a culture war. And it's as if we constantly get into these situations where we think we have to make a choice between unity and diversity. And I always chuckle at the fact that nature seems to have no problem with this at all. When you look at a massive rainforest like the Amazon, is that a unity or is it a diversity? Well, clearly it's both. One is, the one enables the other and vice versa. And that seems to elude us in human society a lot of the time. And I think it's really relevant with religion, that we're not going to get back to a situation where everybody in any given society believes one religion and that is the source of that society's shared values. But at the same time, we can't have a situation where we have no shared values. So that's, I think, what we're sort of having to figure out in real time in conditions of crisis. And it's difficult. But at the moment, I'm doing this course, kind of year-long course that's all about encounter between different religions. So I'm doing the course, there's lots of other Christians on it, but also lots of Muslims, lots of Jews. And it's so interesting being in that kind of conversation and discovering where is there common ground, where are the things we disagree on, but also what is it that kind of holds us together in spite of the things that make us different. And I'm finding it a very enriching experience, wishing it was more typical of politics.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the unity versus diversity, it's a little bit like, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. You're like, okay, well, is Elizabeth Bennet pride and Mr. Darcy's prejudice, or is it the other way around? Are they both a little bit of both? It's a bit like that, in that you can think of let's just I'll really boil it down and be too simplistic, but I think of the hard left, I think of the hard right, and I'm like, which one wants unity and which one wants diversity, actually? Because actually, in a weird way, they both want both. They both do want the same thing, but there's diversity in the fact that it just looks different to each camp. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense, but it's sort of like everyone actually wants cohesion, and like you say, and it's natural to do so. Which I find really interesting, is actually in so many ways there's so much overlap in what each camp wants at any given time.
Do you know one of the things that gave me hope after Brexit? So there's an organisation that has always been a huge inspiration to me, which is More in Common, the organisation that was set up after Joe Cox MP's murder, and kept in very close touch with them over the years. And I remember talking to them not that long after the Brexit referendum. And they do a lot of opinion polling. And one of the things they were seeing very clearly in their polling data, not just here in the UK, but in France and Germany and other countries around Europe, was this huge untapped appetite for a big national project that everyone could get behind and be part of that would lead to some sort of renewal. And I thought that's such a hopeful sign. And I don't think politicians have managed to kind of capitalize on that. It's a sense not just of wanting governments to do it for us. We all want to be part of some big project that brings us together and leads to kind of the renewal that we're all at some sense looking for. And I take a lot of hope for that, from that rather, because that's people all over the political spectrum. And we disagree on things, but we all are feeling that need for renewal and coming together to build something together. And that feels like a really, as I say, a hopeful thing in this moment.
There was a lovely story I read on a recent Substack post of yours about a very practical way in which you saw a kind of a different way of engaging the political thing that I think came out of Turkey. And it's the story. I mean, I am no expert on the politics of Turkey, but essentially there's been this ongoing kind of tussle between different parties and this CHP party. You can explain it better than me, but the way that they, in the midst of a situation where the natural response would have been to fight back, they chose a very different way of dealing with the political situation they found themselves in. I just thought it was a really helpful example. It's an ongoing situation, but do you want to sort of
It's a gripping story. So, it begins in March 2019 and during the Istanbul mayoral elections. And what happened was the CHP, which is a kind of moderate centrist secular party, narrowly defeated the AKP party, which is Recep Tayyip Erdogan's party, so kind of much more authoritarian populist. And CHP supporters were jubilant. But then what happened was that President Erdogan used his influence over the courts to have the result annulled. Now, CHP supporters at this point were absolutely furious.
Understandably.
Wanted to get out on the streets and express that fury. But their leader, who's this very charismatic guy called Ekrem İmamoğlu, spotted the trap that was being laid for them and thought, if we polarize and create a kind of conflict dynamic, yes, that will fire up my base, the CHP supporters, but it will also create a sense of threat among the AKP's base. Polarization will accelerate, and those are the conditions in which Erdogan's type of politics really thrive. So he just thought, right, we're not going to fall into that trap. Instead, we're going to do this campaign called Radical Love. That was what they called it. And it was all about ignoring President Erdogan, but loving the people that love him. That was one of their kind of slogans. And İmamoğlu meant this very literally. He started touring not just the kind of CHP heartlands, but districts that very strongly supported President Erdogan and showing love and affection. Hugging people. I mean, it was very literal. And there was enormous emphasis on showing respect to political opponents. And there was this extraordinary playbook, a kind of guide for campaigners right at the heart of this, which walked them through how important it is for them to be able to kind of master their emotions and stay cool. And they invited people to kind of imagine scenarios. Imagine you're at a street stall and someone comes up to you and gets in your face and starts shouting. Are you going to escalate back, or are you going to kind of stay connected, maintain a sense of encounter, of love in that moment? And there were all these messages about what we have in common, that we speak all these different languages, whether it's Turkish or Georgian or Laz or English, but actually we all ultimately speak the human language. So great messaging, great tactics, great kind of emphasis on this filtering down to individual level and people walking the walk. And the result was that when the rerun election took place in June of 2019, the CHP won a landslide. I mean, it really was the most successful example I've ever seen of a campaign that defeated authoritarian populism. Such a hopeful development. And of course, The story is still unfolding right now because Imamoglu is actually in prison today as we're recording this podcast. The day he was picked as the CHP's candidate in the presidential elections was the day that he was arrested on terrorism charges and imprisoned in Marmara prison in Istanbul. And he's still there right now.
I'm assuming that CHP leader is not a Christian, but nonetheless, the instinct there feels very Christ-like. It's the sort of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, don't respond in the way your enemy is expecting you to respond, because you kind of then just set up this vicious circle, basically. It reminds me almost of the Martin Luther King kind of way of dealing with enemies, not to sort of, we're going to fight back, but we're going to just stand here and do something different, do something unexpected.
And I think exactly as you're talking about there, one of the risks in these situations is that you get that dynamic that political scientists call mutual radicalization, where one side in the argument or in the election or whatever it might be starts to behave in ways that are threatening to the other side, like maybe showing real contempt, a bit like we saw during Brexit. And then as they do so, the other side feels threatened and starts to behave back in ways that make the first side feel threatened. And you get this kind of ping pong where each side is triggering the other side, and there's no real, certainly no transformation happening. It's just each side inspiring each other to higher and higher levels of kind of toxicity and hostility. And when you get in that dynamic, it leads nowhere good. But we do have choices, and we can show up differently in ways that kind of, show respect, that stay connected. And some of the real heroes I have, who I've kind of come across in our work at Larger Us, are people who walk this walk. And one of my favorite examples is this extraordinary African-American blues musician called Daryl Davis. I don't know if you've come across him, but he has persuaded to date more than 200 people to leave white supremacist groups like the KKK in America. And he's done this through the power of kind of connection and encounter and deep listening. And I think, the reason I find him so inspiring is he shows in some way that no one's beyond redemption, that anybody through that kind of power of connection can rethink what they've done.
And never have presumably been able to do that by just sort of hectoring and demonizing.
Absolutely.
It's about actually getting to know your enemy.
And I think, there's a kind of common sense thing that we all know the truth of that in our lives. When one of the things we do at Larger Us is we run this program called Let's Talk Climate, which is all about equipping people to have hopeful, empowering conversations about climate change across political divides, because it turns out like none of us talk about climate change. The data are fascinating. But one of the things that we say in that training is not just to avoid the doom and gloom messages, but avoid kind of showing up in ways that are hectoring or shaming people because they just went on holiday somewhere.
Are you saying that Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion aren't necessarily doing their campaigning in a helpful way? Because obviously that's been one of the big things.
Well, I mean, I used to be really involved in Extinction Rebellion, and I remember being part of a group of people that took charge of a bridge in Leeds one day, and we all sort of felt really fired up. And, over time afterwards, I sort of started to think, how would that have been perceived if you weren't already a climate change activist? And realizing, those sorts of tactics, however sincerely meant, can be incredibly alienating and really rile people and have the unintended consequences of kind of deepening divides rather than engaging people and winning them over. And I think what you see someone like Daryl Davis doing is really making that effort to kind of bridge divides. But if we put people on the naughty step in conversations, if we shame them, how it feels when someone lays a guilt trip on you. You are not going to listen to what they're saying. The barriers go straight up and you're going to tune them out.
Yeah.
What I think about what Daryl's doing, and what he's doing is so hard. Goes against every instinct that is both natural and taught. And so, because there's an element to which he's putting himself in situations that could be incredibly harmful to his own sense of self and to his sense of identity. He's sitting in front of people who wish him harm, I'm sure, a lot of the time.
Right.
And so, I don't really know what my question is, but I guess it's about, are we not are we not expecting this to be hard? Are we expecting our instincts to always lead us in the right direction? Have we forgotten that this is incredibly countercultural and will cost us?
Right.
But that does not mean that it's a bad thing.
That's such a rich point. I mean, you're absolutely right. Doing this kind of encounter is emotional labor. It's blooming hard work. I mean, it costs us to do it. There is a kind of self-sacrificial element to doing this kind of thing. And, there are times when we are not up for it, which is okay. This is very demanding. And when you're not in the right headspace, or you just don't have it in you today to kind of empathize with someone whose views may be kind of, hateful to you, that's absolutely okay. It's not like you're always expected to be ready to have the kind of courageous conversation at any given moment. But it is the thing that transforms. It is the thing that kind of ends wars rather than winning battles, if you like, which is how my friend Kirsty McNeil puts it. And I think that, the soul force involved in that kind of encounter is something that can kind of change lives and change worlds. And we see it, we've come across so many inspiring people in our work at Larger Us who live this out. There's a woman on our board, Dami McKinday, who arrived here in the UK as a child, led a campaign at We Belong, which was all about fighting for the rights of people who'd arrived here in the UK as kids. And she tells this fascinating story about how they put that campaign together, because they could have gone out and shamed the MPs who voted for what was a very unjust system for people who'd arrived in the UK as kids. But what they decided to do instead was not publicly shame people, but try and win them over through just privately meeting and sharing their stories, which are often, quite traumatic personal stories. And one of the things that Dami says is that involved emotional labor. They had to really think about the kind of self-care and time to kind of recharge, because it is, hard work that costs you to retell those stories. But again, a very transformational campaign. It won over so many members of parliament who'd voted for a very unjust law and led to the change in the law that they were looking for.
I wonder if you can give me some personal advice, Alec, which is, we've all been living through this vibe shift, especially on the US front. And I can understand, at one level, I understand why people voted Trump in. Okay. But it's led me to this position where I, as a Christian here in the UK, have a lot of friends who are Christians and I really respect in the US, but they just have voted in someone who I personally find it really difficult to understand why that. Now, I understand these things go back and forth, and yes, the Democratic Party made all kinds of mistakes probably that led to Trump being elected. But at the same time, I'm very aware of that temptation to just hector and disagree and demonize. And it just, because I just see it all the time in my social media, people just breaking down to these factions and lobbing hand grenades at each other. I'm just wondering, what is the best way for someone who feels that same tension? I don't like what my friend has done, but I want to understand, and I want to have a kind of a helpful dialogue, right? Where I'm open to listening, but I'm hoping they're open to listening to me, rather than just entering the echo chambers and the tribalism and everything. And it's tricky as a Christian, again, because there's a lot of Christian language being used from the Oval Office. There's J.D. Vance, talking in quote unquote Christian terms about America first. Basically, the whole Ordo Morris thing was kind of being used as a sort of justification for them putting the needs of Americans first. And then, we're recording this less than a week out from the death of the Pope. He was one of the last people to have an audience with the Pope. But they're, again, two quite different visions, Catholic visions of how religion is meant to serve the common good and so on. So that's just a whole bunch of stuff all in one question. But I suppose the question is, how do we move forward without just doing this fight or flight, demonize the enemy, and never actually make any progress?
So I think part of the answer was contained in your question. You said at one point, I want to understand where people are coming from. And I think when we actually mean that, and we do start by sincerely trying to understand, where are you coming from? What are the things that matter to you? What's led you to, think, to take the views that you have? people can tell when we actually mean it and are genuinely curious. And that immediately leads to a very different conversational dynamic to one where we begin by calling people out or explaining to them in short words, why they're wrong in a patronizing way or something like that. So I think that's part of it. But then I think that showing up with emotional authenticity, not with arguments and facts, but with, how we feel, having first listened to them, also can be transformative. One of my other heroes in all of this is a man called Dave Fleischer. So Dave is an LGBTQ rights campaigner in Los Angeles. And his story is how back in 2008, there was a statewide referendum on equal marriage in California, long before it was kind of legislated for federally. And a bit like with the CHP in Istanbul in 2019, they thought they were going to win, but in fact they lost, and a lot of supporters were furious. But Dave showed up differently. He was curious. And what he did about that was go and start ringing doorbells in really conservative districts in Los Angeles. Not to tell people why they were wrong, not to hector them or shame them, but to genuinely try and understand, I don't get it. Why would you have voted against this measure when it seems common sense to me? And what he found was that when he began by asking people, about their views and how they arrived at them, and then shared some of his own experience, and so that they're finding some emotional common ground, then people would be willing to re-examine their own assumptions. It's not like he's talking them round. He would put it that they're sort of changing their own minds because, there's an encounter happening. And Daryl Davis would say very similar things about what happens with his conversations with white supremacists. So I think there is just this magic that happens when there's genuine encounter, genuine curiosity, that we're not changing people through force of will, but that both sides come away having re-examined some of their assumptions about each other, and that leads to genuine breakthroughs. So I think that the more that's what's so often missing in our politics right now, but we can reintroduce it in our conversations. That's a great place to start.
It's obviously not just going to magically happen in the social media realm or the political world, but we can make a beginning in what we choose to do ourselves with the
totally.
We're sitting down
and hence why our climate conversations program, Let's Talk Climate, is all about inspiring people to just start conversations about climate change, in everyday life, in the queue at the post office, over the garden fence, at the school gate. Because at the moment we have this situation on climate change that there is a consensus actually in favor of climate action across the political spectrum. When you look at opinion polls, that's clear. Politicians don't believe the polling, partly because they don't really hear about climate change all that much from people on doorsteps and so on. So part of our thinking with this kind of campaign is that by inspiring people to have these climate conversations and show up for them with that curiosity that we're talking about, that can kind of make the invisible consensus more visible and start to kind of open up more political space for the ambitious action that it turns out most people want to see on climate. So just having a conversation can actually have big political impacts, and maybe more political impacts than gluing ourselves to the road.
And being aware of your own stuff as well, right? So being aware of the triggers that you bring to a conversation, your own emotion to it. I was chatting to a friend and her and her husband have this whole why I care thing. So when they come across conflict and it's a seemingly irreconcilable conflict, she wants A, he wants B.
Yeah.
They have to tell each other why they care. And then what they'll find is, we care about the same thing, right? You're speaking my language, you've got my values, right? Okay, therefore, let's work together. We can sort this out because apparently we care for the same reason about the same thing.
Yes.
So I think, my introspection skills are on the floor. I'm rubbish. And I sometimes think that's why my success in these kind of conversations might also be a bit on the floor. But the whole why I care thing, it's important to know about yourself as well as about the other.
I have discovered the truth of this in my marriage. My wife and I often joke with each other that the best thing we ever learned to do together was argue safely. That, we will have like lively arguments, but there's a sort of benefit of the doubt there as a bedrock, and a sense that, although we're going to kind of vent and say what we're frustrated about, we do ultimately, trust each other that, we both want good things, and there will be a sort of consensus there. We just got to find our way to it. And I think that's what I wish we trained people for this in educational environments. Yeah. We spent some years living in Ethiopia, and our kids went to this lovely international school full of kind of diplomatic kids. And I remember, my daughter was 4 at the time, and outside her classroom, there was this big poster about what to do when a conflict kicks off. Like literally, we go through these steps together. It was sort of principles of nonviolent communication, if you're familiar with that. And I remember thinking, wow, this is incredible that we're training 4-year-olds to do that. And the teachers made sure that they actually did do it. And then we came back to the UK. This was emphatically not part of what our kids got trained to do at their little kind of, local primary school in Yorkshire. And it seems like this is essential stuff for our own well-being, for the health of our relationships, and for the health of the democracy that we're all part of. And it's nuts to me that we don't, train up the next generation in these skills, because they are very teachable.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that is such a good... What I was hoping, and I said this before we started rolling, I was like, Alex, I'm just hoping you're going to calm me down today. And you have brought hope and brought solutions and brought so much to think about, so much to challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no, thank you both. It's been lovely.
And please do go and check out Alex's... I was going to call it blog, but Substack is the correct terminology these days. The Good Apocalypse Guide. And Larger Us. Where can people find the website for Larger Us?
It's at larger.us.
There you go. So thank you so much. And you have re-enchanted the end of the world for us. It made us hope that actually the end of the world may not be the end of the world. It's could be the catalyst for something good. But lovely to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much again.
Indeed. And thank you. As ever, it would not be the same without you. Thank you for joining us. We hope Alex has calmed you down as well. I'm sure he has. If you are interested at all in making future conversations like this happen, then seenandunseen.com/give is where to go for details. And seenandunseen.com in general is where you can find so many of the topics we've spoken about today, delved into by so many of our amazing contributors. But for now, until next time, it's goodbye from us.